Well, I think we can all see at this point, Battlefield 6 isn't doing as great as it should be. Whether it be AI-generated paid cosmetics, straight-up stolen character designs from Call of Duty, or the devs wrecking the game's core mechanics right before going on holiday, Battlefield 6 isn't dead yet, but Season 1 has been trying its damnedest with a Steam population drop of 80%, while games like Arc Raiders have managed to retain over 90% of their Day 1 numbers. And even the 6-year-old Apex Legends is outperforming EA's latest premium title. Battlefield is currently in a dire position yet again, with lacking content and polish across core modes, awful live service offerings, and what is looking like another failed attempt at a battle royale, which is what I want to get into today. Because all the way in the year of 2026, DICE has managed to drive not their first, not their second, but their third attempt at an additional multiplayer mode into the ground. A mode that was supposed to be at the core of their targeted 100 million player population and the next big driving factor behind EA's earnings. However, the game's population has already fallen below Apex Legends and even Delta Force, marking yet another disastrous chapter in a venture that started all the way back in 2018 with Battlefield 5's Firestorm and has continued its disappointing trend of driving incredibly high potential extraction shooter concepts straight into the ground. And while the current state of Battlefield 6 is tragic, as over 80% of the player base has left within only 2 months, RedSec was supposed to be the free-to-play entry point to inject new players into the franchise. But as we cross over the holiday sales period, it appears that the game hasn't picked up any additional momentum, with plummeting search results and crashing player descent. And while Battlefield's prior attempts like Firestorm with its paywall caused an already limited player base to collapse, and 2042's Hazard Zone was doomed from the start, Battlefield 6's RedSec had every reason to succeed. But today stands as a stark reminder that EA and DICE might never be able to make another great Battlefield ever again, as they don't seem to have the talent or understanding to execute on any new content beyond the game's degrading core loop. And Battlefield 6 had every advantage, wrecking COD out of the gate, a massive player base that was glazing the game at every turn while shitting on their nearest competitor, a top-tier ensemble of paid-off streamers to promote the game, and a totally free-to-play point of access for its big, trendy new mode they'd spent years developing. However, through sheer incompetence, complacency, and ignorance, Battlefield Studios, with well over $400 million in their budget, and surely millions more behind the marketing, created a game that, while packed with potential, showed just how out of touch and out of ideas the franchise has become. And trust me, I wanted this mode to succeed. A last squad standing experience wrapped up with all the destruction and theatrics of the Battlefield formula should be a home run. And perhaps it would have been if the devs could have actually moved the concept forward nearly a decade after they first tried, and actually executed on a gameplay loop that wasn't riddled with bugs and poor game design. But guys, before we jump into today's rant about how Battlefield has yet again killed any chance of expanding on the game's offerings, if you like in-depth reviews, breakdowns, and discussions on all things Battlefield, drop a like and hit subscribe before we talk about the franchise's third failed extraction mode and how to fix it. Now, there's obviously been a ton of discussion around why Battlefield is struggling so much only 80 days since release. And in my last video, I spoke about how bugs and poor quality gameplay is perhaps my biggest issue with the current state of the game. We'll always want more content, we'll always be debating balance, but at the end of the day, it doesn't matter how many maps we get or how well balanced the game is if core mechanics like hit reg, netcode, and performance aren't polished up front. If the game is fundamentally broken, it doesn't matter how much content there is. And to break those sort of fundamentals just weeks into the game's life cycle, right before leaving it in such a state before the holidays, is simply irresponsible. You'd think by this point that DICE would understand they simply don't have the ability to deliver updates without wrecking some part of the core experience, and thus they should be building in buffer periods for updates like Winter Offensive. But instead, the game's core mechanics have been eroding week after week since beta, and I believe it's the central factor to why players are leaving in droves for more polished experiences like Arc Raiders, even if it means jumping to a different genre.
What just happened? What is my game doing? Where'd my gun go?
But while the community has spoken at length about those game-breaking issues, at the end of the day, I think there's two big core issues with the Battle Royale specifically, which feed off those core problems. First off, RedSec Battle Royale just isn't well executed, and its poor design permeates the entire title. Back in my review, I dogged on the mode for feeling underwhelming, basic, and poorly balanced, and for the most part, I still stand by those initial thoughts. But I would argue my initial score of 6 out of 10 was far too high. While I appreciate the denser map design and integration of the Battlefield sandbox, the mode is honestly painful to play at this point.
Oh, okay, straight through the map.
While the early game is perhaps the best part of the experience, the rushed pacing, broken balance, and lackluster mechanics like the missions shows that DICE couldn't think of anything new or how to improve the mode, unlike Delta Force's operations or Arc Raiders' raids. And specific mechanics like the absolutely dogshit audio design combined with the deafening wall fire makes late game and strategic play incredibly unenjoyable. It takes what should be a thoughtful, strategic, paced-out game of chess and throws it all away for cinematics over balance, which is something you can feel across the entire game, along with other decisions about movement, sniper mechanics, and audio. Things like second chance redeploy are again a nice thought, but immediately respawning a squad 30 seconds after they get wiped really undermines the pacing and thoughtfulness of the mode. Players, especially in quads, are constantly respawning where engagements can spiral from a simple squad-v-squad firefight into a scenario that could require up to 16 kills as people constantly respawn mid-fight. A mechanic meant to help casual players get back into the game, but ultimately undermines the game's flow and players' understanding of engagements. Add in the game's already questionable visibility, audio, and netcode, and firefights become sloppy quick. And while I'm not entirely against the idea, both winning and losing against and with vehicles in my time, the inclusion of heavy armor doesn't feel like it's totally thought out. With so many variables within the mode, essential audio that often drops out, and final rings often coming down in the more open central parts of the map, vehicles are a difficult mechanic to make feel fair. But even smaller mechanics like the speed that you apply armor, regenerating FPV drones, and custom snipers that can hide their glint and use a sweet spot one-shot mechanic to break full armor plus 90% health in one shot just make the gameplay incredibly janky and bleed into the rest of the core multiplayer. So while the fanbase puts a lot of focus on the bugs across the entire game, I think those issues combined with poorly designed mechanics were the real downfall of this mode, which again makes me raise questions about Battlefield Labs, as there's so many core issues and poorly designed mechanics with the title's gameplay. And while I'd still argue it has advantages over Warzone, the mode didn't even last with streamers. The fact is, once those checks from EA stopped cashing, the big-name talent, the guys who glazed the game for weeks, suddenly forgot the mode ever existed, as there's no real reason to keep suffering through the poor gameplay as DICE's Season 1 dries up and Battlefield Studios delays the $1 million RedSec tournament after having to admit the game is absolutely nowhere ready for that kind of pressure. But while the game's questionable gameplay might turn away players, I think the fanbase was ultimately more upset with my other big reason this mode died. It does literally nothing to progress the genre or bring something new to the FPS industry. Battlefield has been trying to get a Battle Royale to work since 2018, with Battlefield 5's Firestorm, a game that was released nearly a decade ago. And yet here we are, in 2026, and DICE is yet again driving their next big attempt right into the ground. And like I've said many times before, it's a real shame, because Battlefield should absolutely wipe the floor with Call of Duty in this department. Large-scale, squad-focused, high player count action should be the perfect place for the franchise to be innovating. But instead, after apparently years of development, they created Warzone 2.0 with more bugs, trash balance, and absolutely no player progression around the experience. While the mode certainly feels better in some regards, like the absence of SBMM, there's really nothing here aside from a dated, decade-old formula with zero innovation, reason to play, or even any polish. The mode is stale, played out, and unpolished, so while the game mode might have done well with only one of these issues, the fact is, it's disappointing on almost all fronts in an era of more interesting ideas like Arc Raiders and Tarkov. So at this point, I think the mode needs a total rethink, and this is what I'd personally suggest based on the changes we're seeing in the industry. First things first, I'd focus on reformatting the mode's incentives. Currently, the mode is simply a straight-up battle royale that all relies on being the last man standing, a fun idea, but something we've seen time and time again, and something that really narrows the game's sandbox is you have to solely focus on one single objective like every other player on the map, and hyper-focus your strategy towards one objective, which is incredibly against the spirit of Battlefield. Instead, I think you should take a page from games like Delta Force, The Division, and even Hazard Zone. First, start off by keeping the central objective of being the last man standing, however give that crowning objective specific rewards and incentives. Whether that be lucrative cosmetics, dog tags, track stats, double XP, or my favorite in-game currency like Apex's crafting materials, a semi-premium currency you can cash in for cosmetics elsewhere, adding more tangible rewards would go a long way to giving players a reason to engage and go after certain achievements aside from just weekly challenges. Next, offer a range of secondary objectives like Helldivers does, and have these drop materials for extract like we had in Hazard Zone. Even though that mode was a total joke, the idea of going in, looting valuable currencies, and then putting off extraction for as long as you could was a real thrill. Add a series of secondary objectives that reward currencies like Hazard Zone's hard drives that could be cashed out elsewhere in the game, similar to Delta Force's Mandelbricks. Don't have a million items like Tarkov, but instead add a few valuable assets that could make extracting feel like a real win, with real-world currencies, cosmetics, or Battle Pass tier skips tied to the loot as a reward you can utilize elsewhere in the game. This way, there's multiple ways to play the game and more tangible reasons to jump in, especially for players who wouldn't normally care for a Battle Royale experience. But in order to wrap all this up, the last major change I'd look to add alongside these changes is to allow for alternative extractions. Allow players to chicken out early and forfeit their chance for a potentially larger reward with the final extract. This way, players can jump in, commit to specific objectives or farming they need to complete, and then bug out on their own time, at the cost of losing out on rewards that would come with lasting longer in the circle, and at the cost of a secondary extract that marks them on a map akin to something like The Division. Allowing multiple extractions like Hazard Zone or Delta Force alongside secondary objectives, extractable loot, and ever-increasing incentives with ties to tangible rewards like cosmetics would create a much more complex incentive structure that allows players to pick and prioritize what loot they want to hunt, how long they want to stay before extraction, and ever-increasing rewards for those of whom who stack loot on top of being the last squad standing. As it stands, the Battle Royale feels very linear in creating a system that borrows from extraction shooters with differing incentives, external rewards, loot farming, and ever-increasing payouts every few minutes would really add a lot more thought to the experience. And it's also worth mentioning that creating similar systems in the core multiplayer and campaign would also be great incentives for replayability in those respective modes as players look to master their weapons or find new, weekly rotating collectibles throughout the story. But at the end of the day, I really think that RedSec just needs to add more depth and a better incentive structure on top of all the core mechanical fixes. And in my eyes, creating a system of ever-increasing rewards with optional secondary objectives and alternative off-ramps for players who aren't willing to chase the final extraction bonuses would be a great way to shake up the gameplay and create a less linear experience. Throw in tangible rewards like semi-premium currencies, cosmetics, or Battle Pass tier skips, and you'd have an environment where players are really fighting for something and making decisions based on the fear of losing something tangible instead of just chasing an arbitrary golden star. Battlefield Battle Royale has really become an unnecessary weight around the game's development. What should be a fresh take on an aging genre by one of gaming's greatest trend-setting franchises has become nothing but a dated, empty, and broken example of why Battlefield might not last much longer as a franchise. and a mode where the devs are now most likely going to have to sink months of work to save their big 100 million player ambitions. But I highly doubt that we'll see any significant changes at this point. If after 4+ years in development, they believe this was the answer to their new big mode, then it just shows that EA and Battlefield Studios still don't get it. They don't understand the industry, they don't know what players want, and they certainly don't have the ability to execute even basic ideas in a high-quality manner. But guys, let me know what you'd like to see out of this mode in its current state. I don't think it really has any way of pulling Battle Royale fans away from Warzone, nor offering anything new to the genre unless it's totally overhauled. But for everything else Battlefield, stay tuned and subscribe, and as always, thank you guys for watching.